what were they studying? It was really what happens. I was like, okay, well, DMT itself, it's going to be like wildly metaphysical and full of entities. And it was that. Absolutely, it was all those things. But there was always a mix of personal stuff and metaphysical, but certainly the first couple were very like, you got to work on your shit before you get to see aliens was kind of the message. It was like, the message was actually like, you can go to hyperspace, but you got to take your baggage with you, and your baggage needs packing in a different way. It's very powerful.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends, and I am aware it is something of a grandiose thing to ask big questions about life's meaning, and even bigger ontological throbbers like, what is the point of humanity at large? What are we? What exactly are we doing here? How do we fit in the metaphysical hierarchy, if that's even a thing? Still, obviously, I can't help but ask such questions. For whatever reason, I'm compelled to do it. And I do think that it's important to investigate, to study, to talk about these things, come to some sort of intellectual understanding for yourself. But that said, intellectualizing only goes so far. At some point, you must attempt to look. You must visit the luminous, terrifying, fractal frontier for yourself. At least that's how I feel. At least that's what feels genuine to me. And that's where my friend Alexander Beiner comes in. And that's one of the many reasons I've come to love this guy, because he really does it. He really does the work, and he does all of the above. He investigates to the highest intellectual level he's capable, and that enables him to bring back really unique insights from these frontiers of consciousness. He's also the author of a truly fantastic book, The Bigger Picture. He's co-founder of Rebel Wisdom, which was one of my favorite podcasts when they were active, and he was one of the very few participants in one of the most insane academic studies to ever occur at Imperial College London, where they subjected a few volunteers to extended state DMT, which is, if you're not aware, one of the most psychoactive substances on the planet, with all kinds of mind-blowing, impossible to fully explain phenomena associated with it. He's also the executive director of Breaking Convention. So yeah, this guy is going where few people have gone, is doing what few have done, and he's also a top-notch riffer, so he could not be a more ideal partner to have back in the mind meld. All the links you're going to need for Alex are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And yes, I will once again remind you that tickling the algorithm is of the utmost importance. Those likes, subs, shares, comments, they all really mean a lot. They help us grow. And on that note, I must recognize the fact that we just hit 50,000 subscribers. So I love you all. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, and I do hope it continues to tickle your wonder nuggets. We've also got a back catalog of hundreds of mind melds with brilliant beings that only exist in the audio dimension, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen. Actually, there's probably going to be an audio-only pod with Alex in the not-too-distant future, because this is actually our third podcast, not our second, because we lost the video file on the last one. So you have that to look forward to wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, I must blast love and gratitude to our 230-something patrons over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. If you don't know, over at Patreon, you can not only support the show, but you can get in on monthly Zoom hangs, a book club, a patron-only Discord server, get physical rewards like these and more only at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with Alexander Beiner. Deep welcome back to the Mind Meld. And again, I will publicly apologize for not being able to publish our previous one, at least to the video. I did publish it for the patrons, and they're all loving it. But yeah, we lost our video file, and it was a real shame, because it was a fantastic one. But yeah.
It's cool, man.
The digital trickster had other ideas.
It did. And, it was genuinely one of my favorite conversations in recent memory. But at the same time, I feel like in some way it's meant to be, right? Maybe there was
Yeah,
more to come out. I feel like we could have talked longer actually in that conversation. So let's roll with it, man. Yeah.
I do too. I do too.
Mm,
You're one of those people that I could riff with endlessly. I mean, you have such an
likewise.
wide breadth of experiences. You're really one of these people who does that inner work and that inner exploration. It seems like via whatever portal you have access to. And
It's
I
nice.
said we were going to start similar to how we started last time, but now this question is immediately coming to mind. Can you put your finger on where that impulse comes from for you? Was there a moment where you were like, anytime I come across one of these portals, I'm going to jump in? Because a lot of people think about doing these things, think about having a visionary molecule experience or going deep into meditation or whatever the case may be. And maybe they'll do it once, maybe they'll do it twice. But you seem to be focused on this. This seems to be something that is like a mystery that you cannot resist.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is the word mystery, right? So I think if there's, um, yeah, I guess if there's something that draws me to these different practices and experiences, it's mystery, but not to solve a mystery, because
Yeah.
that is a very different kind of mindset. If we're trying to like approaching a mystery in order to solve it is a bit like watching a crew crime documentary or something. And you're like, oh, okay. You're kind
Yeah.
of like, you're basically the entire time trying to get to the denouement, like the point. You're like, okay,
Yeah.
when's the big reveal, and that's great.
Ooh.
That's fun too. Right. But I think there's something very different about the kind of mystery that we're talking about here, which is like the mystery of being a human being. And that is endlessly fascinating. I think there's no bottom to that well to dive into. I think that's what really draws me to this. And there's also another word that feels important is like truth. Is
Mm.
I love the phrase like having a love of the truth, which is goes into inner work and also for me in psychedelics as well. It's like I want to figure out not necessarily the grand truth, but what is true for me at
Right.
least. What is actually the truth of my experience, and that is a very compelling I would say compulsion in a way. I want to know, and
Yeah.
I feel like not well, I guess many people probably have this feeling. We know if we're not being totally true with ourselves or honest with ourselves, there's like a little niggling
Yeah.
going on. And of course, as human beings, there are times we're just like, okay, I'm just going to let that play out, or I'm going to avoid that. That's just what we do as humans. But I think, especially with psychedelics or breath work or deep meditation, you enter a state where that little niggle becomes loud, and it
Mm-hmm.
becomes much
Mm-hmm.
more, much more difficult not to look at it. And I love that because I just find the whole dynamic of like having of what goes on in our minds, that we have some sense of what's actually true. Like, how do I truly feel about something?
Yeah.
Or what do I truly want out of life? Or what's my real relationship to nature? All of these questions, like there is an answer there. There is a solidity, and there's a place we can come
Mm.
to where we have this kind of aha revelation of, yeah, okay. And the feeling that we have, or certainly the feeling I have after those moments, is one of real quiet and wholeness and centeredness. Like I'm not lacking anything. And I think probably if I think about it, I want that feeling as much as
Yeah.
anything else. I want the feeling of just like enoughness, like I'm just present. And that, yeah, that's the magic of especially psychedelics for me.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of truth that's brought about in those states is one of those things that is so difficult to talk about because it's like a subjective phenomenological kind of truth
Yeah.
that's not, obviously it's, you can't write it. Maybe you can write down an insight or a little piece or something you catch from the stream of the mysterium fascinosum, but it's like the kind of truth that's like, it's just
Yeah.
so much truth that you can't even comprehend it, but just somehow being exposed to the raw vastness of it
Mm.
is some it satisfies something. It like scratches some kind of itch that you can't even make intellectual sense of, but it's saying it's therapeutic. I mean, I think that's the common a common way to characterize it these days, but it's therapeutic like climbing Mount Everest is therapeutic. It's like a kind of therapy that also hurts, but
Yeah.
it's scratching all the archetypal areas in your entire being, like even ones you don't want to scratch, but they need that catharsis, like they need that expression, and there's almost no other way to get it than to go into these non-ordinary states, it seems
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. Just on that, because you
mhm,
touched on something really interesting there, which I haven't really thought about much, which is the difference between the way we use the word therapeutic in culture, which
mhm,
is kind of around understanding oneself.
yeah,
It's like, I know why I feel like this because of my own patterning and my childhood and this and that, these experiences, and that's really important. That's good work. However, there is also like a very different kind of healing, or kind of healing is also a loaded term. Let's say a
mhm,
kind of like coming to wholeness as a human being, which
yeah,
isn't all about us and is about embedding ourselves back into the world where we belong. Like we have a sense of deep connection and belonging. And John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist whose work I really love, he talks about this as like the heart of the meaning crisis, this
mhm,
crisis of meaning and direction in Western culture in particular, is a lack of connectedness to the world, like a
right,
lack of actually being like embedded in something. Our culture doesn't really have a connection to the land. We have capitalism. We're all consumers, and we're all sort of globally expendable, and we can all basically, jobs here can be done over there, and if they can, that's better. There's no sense of connectedness to place. There's no sense of connectedness to history or to ritual,
yeah,
and that's a big part of, I agree with him, and I think that's a big part of why we have why we have a mental health crisis to begin with. It's not the only reason, but it's, I certainly think, a factor.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody can relate to that feeling of being an alien
Yeah.
in culture, even in your own, in where you grow up, even in your own family. Sometimes you feel like you this sense of not belonging because there's something that no one else understands. There's something that you don't feel. I felt this profoundly as a kid, man. Like I was always questioning why people did things and why they liked things and why they went to this church and why they had this job, and I just didn't get it. And to a large extent I still don't, which is why I'm doing this weird shit for a living. But at the same time too, like I have a birthday coming up, and every time there's a birthday it's like you can either be like, yeah, another year, whatever, and that's kind of the way I typically treat it. But then you start to see how your parents react to it, and it's different for them because they're like,
Mm.
I have a child that's this age. And to them, it's like it's getting more existential as they get older. And like
Mm.
my dad did something actually like very, that really brought me deep into this space of recognizing this. He like made a photo album and
Oh.
wrote this like really long letter to me. And it was I'm not going to repeat it because it's way too kind. And that was the thing that really planted me, like made me feel my familial roots of like,
Yeah.
and it really felt kind of psychedelic because it's like you're looking at these pictures of you as a kid and you're like, I don't even feel like I'm this person, but I am this
Mm.
person. And I did have these experiences and I do vaguely remember this stuff. And the older you get, I feel like the more psychedelic the early parts of your life feel. And it
Mm.
actually reminded me of this experience I had the first time I ever did like a 5 gram dose of psilocybin, and it was a true kind of family tree, world tree type experience
Wow.
where I literally felt like a plant, like a fruit on a vine, on a limb, on a plant, where it's like, oh, this limb is my family, and then that connects to this limb, and then this connects to this limb, and it
Mm.
it sounds like this must be metaphorical and that it wasn't really like a tree, but it really was like this almost kind of like pulsing, fractal, waving, I don't know, Axis Mundi style feeling thing of like, wow, I really am part of this stream of souls and history. And like it felt palpably real in that experience.
Wow. I love that. And presumably that those roots go all the way down to a
Oh, yeah.
shared common ancestor, right? But very possibly. I mean, I think that is the consensus, that there's a. I mean,
Yeah.
even if it was a single protozaic or whatever, that's probably not a word, but like little single-celled organism. So yeah, that's I love that. I love that image.
Yeah. Yeah. When I did my 23andMe, which, yes, everyone in the comments tell me that I shouldn't have done it. I know. But yeah, it says in there that everybody can be traced back to some common ancestor, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
really, really mind blowing. It, and what really breaks my brain is I think there's a common male ancestor and a common female ancestor, but they lived at different times, which is
Interesting.
working out how that even works. I don't understand, but isn't it interesting that there's so many creation myth or even just like esoteric systems that posit this idea of the primordial man as well. Like obviously you have Adam and Eve in the Christian faith, but in to the Kabbalists, there's Adam Kadmon, who's like the cosmic man, and he's the first you know incarnated being basically. And
Yeah.
then I just finished doing a fairly deep dive into Plato's Timaeus, which is the um, holds this esoteric Pythagorean creation account in it, and it's all drenched in geometry and ratios and harmonic Pythagorean stuff, and it's both fantastic and terrible to read. Like it was a rough read for me, but there's so many mind-blowing tidbits in it, and that's one of them. This idea that when and this is where the word demiurge comes from, by the way. This is the
Oh,
very first text that ever used the word demiurge, and the demiurge is good in this, and he is a specific um emanation of the transcendent one and the divine nous slash mind and the the forms and everything, and then he uses the divine mind essentially to build the cosmos. But anyway, that's one of the things that they say, is that the cosmos is a living, breathing being. And
hmm.
it has basically all of the faculties that all other animals and creatures have. And then there's this as above, so below kind of reflected relationship all the way down to the tiniest organism level that somehow is abiding by these same uh, laws, these like fractal, geometric, mathematical, cosmic laws. And we're all living and breathing all the way up to the largest possible thing that we can comprehend, I guess.
Wow, I love that. I mean, that reminds me of the concept of the holographic universe, right? With also the part these fractal parts containing the whole within them, and this kind of like bottom up and top down at the same time. um of reality. Yeah, that's cool. I wasn't familiar with that. I mean, I know, like, that's interesting. I knew the word demiurge. Is it Greek, the word
Yeah.
demiurge?
Yeah.
Yeah, does
It's
it mean
it's
the maker, like the creator, like?
craftsman. Yeah.
Yeah,
Craftsman.
craftsman. Yeah, so I think I had some sense that like it didn't necessarily have a bad connotation until it became one for the Gnostics. But
Right.
yeah, interesting. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. 100%. I won't do this because it's cheesy, but I was thinking I should make merch that says make the demiurge good again in like a make America great again
Yeah.
font or something.
Yeah.
But that's it's one thing to read these esoteric um philosophical texts, and it's a completely other thing to have an experience that seems to mirror what they're talking about in these
Mm.
texts. And that's another thing that seems to reliably happen in these non-ordinary states of consciousness, is this sort of, for me, it's mixed with a kind of fear and trembling almost, because you feel the raw power of what you're not aware of and exposed to in normal consensus reality. It's like you
Yeah.
become aware that there is this just energy field and unspeakably complex ecosystem of things that I'm not even sure what to call. And I'm having pareidolia where I'm seeing like faces and trees and stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like, it's both unveiling and complicating the experience, I think, in a way that's co- like paradoxically more real and also illusory in some
Yeah.
strange kind of way. But when you start to feel like, oh no, the idea of reality living and breathing is not a metaphor. Like I am genuinely feeling like I am participating in the pneuma of, the vital energy of creation, and it extends into and through and around me and everything else. And that's an intense experience, but it's a very powerful and life altering one.
Absolutely. There's this feeling of for me with psychedelics, there's a feeling of familiarity coupled with complete strangeness that
Yeah.
is just so distinctive of the experience. It's both feelings at once, right? It's new and really familiar. Like there's nothing quite like that, and then it also, I also often wonder whether there's those moments of just sort of breathing with reality and being completely immersed in it, and just being, especially in nature, especially if I have an experience in nature, and then I've had these experiences where it feels like there's also the kind of thought signature of human beings through history, right? Like I remember one time being in the Algarve in Portugal, on LSD, and just walking through the hills and just seeing on the hills this very, very specific family crest that was just
Mm,
like an S and a V. It looked like something you'd see on a wine bottle. And it was just all over the hills, and these huge letters just kind of throbbing. And it was like quite ornate and specific.
wow.
And I just was kind of looking at it for ages, being like, that was really unexpected. It's like really different to all my other imagery, really odd. Like it had a sense of meaning to it. And I was like,
Yeah.
who knows? Who knows? Maybe I saw it in a wine bottle, but also the sense I had is like, okay, whoever that family was, this meant something to them. Their imprint is on this land, and that's just I love the strangeness of that, because I have no attachment necessarily to that land myself. I was just there on holiday, it's just like a long time ago, but I was like, that kind of thing is amazing. And it's the kind of thing that shows up in that book LSD and the Mind of the Universe by
Yeah,
Chris
Chris.
Beich.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, yeah, that book's amazing. And there is this sort of like levels of archetypal experience that he's going through with his 70 plus LSD trips he takes. And so there's something about, I think, that can happen in lots of psychedelics, but I find it interesting that people report that in LSD. I wonder why that is. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not quite sure either. And just to fill in the context a little more for people so Chris Beige he's this retired is he a professor? Was he teaching religious
I
studies
think it
or
was
like
religious
philosophy or
studies.
something?
Yeah, I think it was
Yeah.
religious studies. Yeah.
So he's teaching this and secretly, basically throughout his whole career, doing these extreme high dose, like deep dives, and doesn't really tell anybody about it until decades later. And when he retires and he writes this book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
I mean, it's very brave. I read it before I did the my DMT, or maybe it was after I did the DMT extended state. But I
Oh, wow.
certainly read it and was thinking, we've read it with a lot of respect, and had a few chats with him, and really admire him as a person as well. But he, there's these like whole swathes of his trips of like 15, 20 trips in a row, which is, I think he calls it like the ocean of suffering, where he's just
Yeah.
living the suffering of every woman who's ever been alive, every child who's ever been alive, every man who's ever been alive. And it's just like, I mean, like the balls to just like be like, huh, well, my last 5 trips were the ocean of suffering, of taking on all the
Yeah.
suffering of the world. Maybe the next trip will be good. And then being like, nope, nope, more ocean of suffering, but I'll keep going. I mean, just the dedication is pretty astonishing.
It really is, and it's so tough. I mean, those tough experiences are just, they really test your will and your desire to go back in. Like, I've told these stories so many times, so I won't go deep into them. But just ayahuasca being so challenging for me every time, man. Every single one of those
Yeah.
experiences, I'm like, I'm not doing this again. There's no way. But being in a retreat setting when you're with people, and it fades just enough by the next day that you're
Yeah.
like, it's probably, no, it wasn't that bad. It couldn't have been that bad. And plus everybody else is doing it. And you're like, yeah, I gotta go back in there. I gotta go back in there. But
Oh man.
being alone is different. That's like, you can make any excuse and not go back. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Definitely. I think there is something about ayahuasca in particular and DMT. Well, with DMT, I think the forgetfulness of DMT is faster than other psychedelics in my view. The sort of dreamlike kind of like,
Yeah.
forgetting the specifics. It happens with all of them, but I think it happens possibly with DMT more. It's so funny though, because it's something about that suffering, particularly with ayahuasca. I think with other psychedelic experiences, it is an initiatory suffering experience, and a lot of initiation into a new way of seeing the world comes through suffering. I have these memories of there was a time I did lots of ayahuasca ceremonies, maybe like over a period of some years, both in Europe and South America, maybe did like 50 or odd
Wow.
ceremonies, over time. And then I haven't actually in quite some time, but I have a huge amount of respect for it as a teacher. But I remember very early on being just saying, just kind of being in the space where I was like, no, 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 no. And for years afterwards, at different phases of my life, I've tried to figure out what was I saying no to, and it's changed over time.
Wow.
So sometimes I'm like, okay, it was this thing. And then later on, I'm like, no, 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 it was this thing. And then 3 years later, it'll pop into my head randomly. I'm like, maybe it was this thing. And they've all been true, which is kind of, I don't know. There's something fascinating about the way that,
Yeah.
that ayahuasca in particular imparts that kind of teaching and information.
Yeah. One thing that I want to linger on for just a second that's so I can't wrap my mind around it, but I think it's important. And I was trying to talk about it in the recent pod I did with my friend Eric Godsey, and we were talking about this weird kind of sort of not asynchronous isn't the right word, but
Mm.
these indirect kind of insights that you can have in these experiences that don't make a straight line kind of sense. They make some kind of weird subjective sense that's something like paired with something like let's use trauma as an example because it's a
Mm.
common thing where people feel like they get some kind of really
Mm.
healing catharsis and heal or make progress on some trauma. You may have a vision or feeling that is not in any logical way connected to that thing that you suffered, but yet it somehow feels fed or healed or operated on by
Mm.
by some kind of experience that you have. So like the no you were experiencing,
Mm.
that could be like tangentially related to things that have happened to you,
Mm.
like things that you're trying to work out in your
Yeah.
head, things that will happen to you maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah,
but
that's
it's
the
like
thing. Yeah.
it's one of those things where in these states things make sense that don't normally make sense, but it's not just that they make sense, it's that you really have a kind of psychological or spiritual or emotional access to things
Mm.
through pathways that otherwise are not normally available to you. And it's you can't wrap your mind around it, but it's true, it seems like.
Yeah, and you're in. I think it might have been Joseph Campbell who talked about mythic time
Ooh.
often. Like so there's normal linear time, and then myth brings us into this time, which is sort of a. I can't describe it that well, but I'm not super familiar with it. But my remembering of it is that it's kind of like a different time zone that exists in and of itself, and it sort of
Wow.
interpenetrates everything else. And psychedelics, I would say, would be my experience of mythic time, because there's also the experience of going back, like with ayahuasca, for example, or same with DMT. It's like, okay, I'm back in the same place, or I'm back, and it's not
Yeah.
like being back in the same place, like going back to the same field you've been to before, or the same tree, or the same house. It's a different kind of return, but
Yeah.
it's still familiar, or it's like, oh yeah, I've been in this specific cavern before, or I've been in this specific I don't know, energy before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we talked about this a little bit last time. And now you've also brought up the fact that you were a participant in this extended state DMT trial, and I'm sure that if we just skip over, there's a lot of people be, no, go back to that, go back, even though you've talked about it a million times.
That's
We've
cool. I'm
talked
happy
about it
to.
before,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it is so novel, man, and it is so bleeding edge in terms of what the human psyche has ever experienced. There are just not that many people who have had that experience that you've had, where, again, for people who don't know, you were set up in a similar setup to, like, if you were going to go into surgery,
Yeah.
with an IV, with a a drip essentially of the most psychoactive tryptamine on the planet, and just a constant infusion for an extended state of time.
Yeah.
And I every time I tell this story to other people, I can't remember what they were actually even supposedly studying. Like, just like we want to, like, see, blood pressure and, like, what, like, but yeah. So refresh my memory on that, and also, just reflect on it, and however you want to, and doesn't bore you at this point, because you've talked about it so
I
many
appreciate
times.
it. So what were they studying? Yeah, this was kind of a mystery to me, which it was probably meant to be because I was a participant. It was generally like, it was really what happens, because with a kind of loose link to maybe it has therapeutic benefit in the future, which I would actually say, surprisingly for me, it absolutely does. It was very personally transformative in a way that I don't, having had DMT experiences vaporized before, not that many. I think I'd had like 5 before I signed up for the trial. But had a lot of ayahuasca experiences. I was like, okay, well, DMT itself, it's going to be like wildly metaphysical, and full of entities. And it was that. Absolutely. It was all those things. But also the first, it was 5 dosings. 1 was placebo. So it was 4 dosings total, over months. And the first, there was always a mix of personal stuff and metaphysical, but certainly the first couple were very like, you got to work on your shit before you get to see aliens, was kind of the message. It was like, the message was actually like, you can go to hyperspace, but you got to take your baggage with you, and your baggage needs packing in a different way. It was very powerful, and it was really like very, very deep, incisive, incredibly the most sophisticated teaching that I've experienced on psychedelic. And well, yeah, I feel bad to the mushroom experience by saying that, because that's also been profound. It's just different. Let's say it's different, but it was very, very incisive in the teaching. And the and I always get this sort of, I always have a dialogue when I take psychedelics, like a kind of I call it like a teach. In my book, I write about the DMT extended state trial. I use it as kind of a narrative thread through looking at the bigger cultural potential of psychedelics, but I call it the teaching presence, because that's what it feels like. And that was my guide through the experience. And then of course DMT is very different to some psychedelics. Like, you have a lot of agency. I mean, I think you have agency with other psychedelics, but there's a lot of you can choose where to go in a lot of ways, especially when you have that much longer in it. Usually you vaporize DMT, you just don't have time, because it's just like, what the fuck? It's just what the fuck for the first 3 minutes. And then by the time you have your feet, you have like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, maybe a little bit longer for the peak. And then it's starting to go away. So you really don't have a lot of time. So I basically wanted to, I did like my own training regime for the trial. It had nothing to do with what they were doing in Imperial, but I was like, I did a lot of, I work with a coach called Trish Blaine, who specializes in non-ordinary states. And so we sort of like had like a kind of almost like a Rocky, I always had the image of like Rocky training for a fight. I was like, okay, right. How am I gonna cope with being hit? How am I gonna do this? How am I gonna get my stamina up? And a lot of it, like one part of it was just to take Terence McKenna's lesson from one of his experiences, was don't give way to amazement. The entities told him that once. And I was like, okay, that feels really important, because I know that initial rush can just be like so discombobulating. So, and the thing is, it is like when it came in through the drip, it was like vaporizing DMT. So from 0 to, there's this, it makes me shiver talking about it, but there's this sort of moment of feeling the cold go into your vein. And I would feel that, and I would be like, oh, fuck. Okay, it's happening, because they didn't tell us when it was getting injected, because
they
didn't
couldn't warm it up for you a little bit.
No, I know, right? It's like blowing on it or something. But yeah, so I asked them. I was like, "Could you give me a courtesy tap? Can you let me know like when it's going to go in? And they're like, nah, because we thought about that, but it'll make everyone's heart rate spike up as we tell them that. So it usually came in at a particular time that I was able to. By dosing 5, I knew roughly when it was coming in, and we had headphones on with like a kind of spacey music, and every now and again there was like a kind of intensity rate. It would be like minute 3 intensity rating 0 to 10. So you knew what the minutes were. So eventually I was able to be like, but I didn't know the exact moment, right? And so there's a sense of cold coming in, and then maybe 3 or 4 seconds after that, just complete full DMT space, instantly. And so the phase shift in my body would be very extreme. And I just have to breathe through that and focus, and stay present and just meet whatever was coming up. And it was often I went into the same space. I went into this sort of like waiting room cavern type area, which this is so bizarre. There is this trope in DMT about like the nursery, like where people go first going in. And what was so weird about it was that, what's even weirder about this, this is really synchronous right now. I had been to this park in London with my cousin, who I don't see that often, who I just spoke to before this, which is also really fucking weird because this is the first time I spoke to him in like 6 months. But we had walked past a playground that has zero resonance for me. I've seen this playground once. That had no importance to me whatsoever. Actually, though, there was what we were talking about when we walked past it. Maybe did. That's the first time I've realized that.
Okay, because I remember you brought this up last time, and we were that is weird, and just kind of what was that?
We were talking about something related to my family that's quite long standing and quite intense, and that's why it probably. I don't know why it showed up, but in any case, it was fascinating because there's so many layers to this. That was what I was working on in that first experience. And it was also the sense of the overlay of a nursery or a playground is something where you keep kids to entertain them and kind of keep them safe. Mm-hmm. So I would often be there. And then like a lot of people talk about with DMT, I would sort of break through into what felt like what was beyond that. And sometimes it was like, I remember one time really specifically there was something I was tracking in this cavern. I was like, maybe I'll follow that. Because I would just be like, how do I get out? Like, I want to find stuff. I'm just like, just curious. I want to explore. I remember like tracking something, this kind of like lanternfish type thing. There wasn't full of entities there. Right. And then I remember like turning my head past my shoulder. And I knew also I could have the sense of like my proprioception in the room, in this hospital room. And I was aware there was a medic sitting there who's also taking blood out of one arm. And I was like, I'm going to hit the medic, but I'm also in DMT space at the same time. And then that's how I broke through one time. And then I was in a completely different space. Wow. And so, it was absolutely fascinating. It was really, it was quite life-changing in a lot of ways. It was really much more of a journey. And I knew it would be a journey and a process, but I also didn't really, I think I tried not to think about it while I did a lot of prep, I also tried not to think too hard about what it was going to involve, because I was also quite scared. It's crazy. I was like, what the fuck is going to happen? They're doing another one now too.
Wow.
That I'm signed up for, which is not extended state, but I don't know how much I can say about it, but it is, it's really experimental. It involves more than one person. So it's like,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow,
so I think it's going to be really interesting. So, and that one I signed up for without hesitation. They also have a 5-MeO study coming up, which I also signed up for, which I feel more ambivalent about, to be honest, because I've had one 5-MeO DMT experience, which was only about a year ago. Not even. It's not even a year now, which was really profound, very beautiful. But the first 3 or 4 minutes of it were kind of absolutely terrifying. Like I thought I was like, fuck, I've broken myself. It was like right.
That's what I've universally heard almost. Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard a bunch of people say it as well. And it was almost like being pulled up into non-dual reality, but being stuck in my own stuff. And then I had a huge cathartic emotional release. And then I had much more of a beautiful free expansion. But I have a lot of respect for it, because those few minutes were the first time on psychedelics I felt quite like that type of ego dissolution in that way at that speed, and I felt like I was just like, it was like 3 weeks before my book came out. And the thought I had was, I was like, oh man, this is so fucking tragic. I've got a book about psychedelics coming out and I've just literally blown my mind on
Yeah.
psychedelics. It's so embarrassing. And then I felt like the sadness, but I then I had a really good sitter. And then also I leaned into that, the principles still apply, I think, of life and being, of like, accept, breathe, be with it, be with whatever's coming up. And that's what would unlock kind of the deeper the emotional catharsis, which would go somewhere else. But it was very scary. It was really scary. And I'm like, I don't mind doing DMT and NDMT in a hospital room where it feels quite sci-fi, where like we're boldly going
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
not no one has gone before, because plenty of shamans have gone there before, but we're boldly going where no scientists and people in the West have gone before that much.
Yeah.
And that feels different. There's a different energy to that. But with 5-MeO, it's the sacredness and the power of it. I think hopefully, I don't know what the dose is, but I'm hoping the dose will perhaps be lower than the quite high dose I had. So yeah, but I like also contributing to the science.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it's,
Yeah.
yeah. It's not the main reason I'm doing it. It's definitely a significant part of it as well, as like, let's see, like, what is, like, I share that curiosity of the science. I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, and
Right.
I want to see each level of it. I want the phenomenological level, which I'm much more interested in, the spiritual level, but I also want to know what the brain, body, blood. I want to know all that stuff too. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? This is so unbelievably weird. It's just
Yeah.
so weird that DMT exists. It's just
It's
like,
so weird.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
so incredibly weird. And the weird, we're just only scratching the surface of the weirdness, because one of the other things again, I know I talked about this recently, but it's impossible not to talk about when we're trying to discuss the bleeding edge of what it's possible to experience as a human being. And what ends up happening is, in all of these subjective experiences, because there is no empirically measurable thing that we can all agree upon, be like, I have this math equation here, like we can all agree that it means this, right? We have this word here, we can all agree that it means this, right? So what you're forced to do is apply a interpretive lens to the experience. And then, depending what interpretive lens you choose to use, it's sort of, in a Trojan horse way, gives you an answer. Like, if you use a spiritual lens, you get a spiritual answer. If you use
yeah,
a neurochemistry lens, you get a neurochemical reductionist answer somehow. And in doing that, if you want to be the best possible arbiter or delivery man of truth, you have to like mix lenses in the
yeah,
best way that you can, and try to look for what's truer beyond the lens in the telling of it. And we've talked about before some of the specifics of these experiences, but and you've briefly mentioned some of them already, like beings everywhere.
yeah,
Um, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is your sense of space, like your sense of, you know, here there is a ground. My
yeah,
feet are on the ground, and there's a sense of navigation that makes complete sense, you know. But along with oh, and just I want to go back real quick and just
mhm,
say that your story of this innocuous slide park area being like the entryway to Tartarus or whatever, or the astral realm, or whatever you want to call it, depending what it felt like in there. That's kind of an example of what I was talking about before, where there is no logical relationship between things, but
yeah,
things can just serve as portals to other things. And that's a really interesting example
yeah,
of, why is this
yeah,
place the portal? I don't know, but when you're there, it probably makes some weird kind of sense. And then afterward, you're like, that makes no sense. But
yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah,
moment, it makes
absolutely.
some kind of weird sense. Um, but yeah, your sense of space, and because you mentioned feeling like you got your quote unquote feet under you and you were able to navigate.
Mm,
I I don't really feel like I've ever achieved that, like on any kind of high dose. I more so feel like I'm on a ride, like the more of that kind of a feeling. So
yeah.
is there it is there like a dual, is there like a dyad sort of sense of self where you're still aware of your body and your mind and your earthly ego, or does all of that go away and you're completely sort of dissolving into whatever this other space is and you're navigating that space? Yeah, elucidate
Yeah.
that a
It's
bit
a really
for
good
me.
question because it's something unique about DMT. I think like it's you have a lot of agency. And Rick Strassman, who did the first, really I would say one of the first studies of the psychedelic renaissance, when he
Yeah,
studied DMT, he argues that DMT gives you a prophetic experience, which means that it's an experience like the mystical experiences described in the Bible,
yeah,
which often involve someone being visited by an angel or the booming voice of God coming out of a burning bush. So you have an agent receiving information from the divine, which is very different to say a Buddhist or model of dissolving into everything, becoming nothing, right? And kind of connecting to the nothingness and the wholeness that imply one another. Very different type of mystical experience. So DMT tends to be prophetic, which means that you're there, you in some capacity, although my sense of my body was definitely different. I often had the sense of floating in a void or
mm,
floating in space, like
yeah,
floating in, just like having no gravity around me, but having direct, uh, the agency is really interesting. Like there was one moment where, and it was different in different moments. Sometimes it was like being on a roller coaster and it was just like, fuck, what's, but I was
yeah,
still choosing where to look and choosing how to interact with entities and choosing, it was just a lot. And so it was a little bit more discombobulating. And sometimes the teaching presence would guide me through these sort of like vast landscapes of like, planetary sized entities and, giant enormous spider queen and, just like really profoundly alien landscapes, and I was being guided somewhere. So I was sort
yeah,
of, I wasn't really, but I also had the ability to zoom into things to be like, okay, something's pulling me over here. Like, I want to go over here. And sometimes, right after the dosing, when I was in this kind of cavern type space, there was one time where the thing is, nothing was happening very often there. It would be like I would burst through, and then it would just be kind of like not a lot of activity. There was often this kind of geometric orb, which I see on all tryptamines.
mm,
Actually, I always see the same orb, even on
really,
MDMA sometimes, just like in the center of my vision.
okay,
If I have my eyes closed, it's a very familiar sort of green blue geometric orb. So that was there. And then I was just in this kind of cavern, and I literally sometimes was like, "Hello, anyone there?" kind of thing, kind of calling out. And then because I was quite like focused, I was like really like, I want to get as much out of this as possible, because 40 minutes of DMT does sound like a long time, but we all acclimatized to it. Like all of our heart rates
interesting,
shot up,
interesting,
like almost like doubled, I think, like for a couple minutes, like spike, like we're all like, whop, okay, this is really fucking intense. And then after a couple minutes, we all leveled off and we're like, okay, so I think that's about the drug itself, or it's about the psychological acclimatization. Maybe it's that we were all really experienced psychonauts, and we it wasn't all totally new to us. I don't really know. I'm not sure. Maybe they're going to study that. That'd be interesting to know. So at that point, it's different. Each, like there's more of a continuity and a flow to it, like a normal trip, And so it reminded me mostly of ayahuasca, to be honest, which is effectively extended state DMT in some
right,
ways, except without the harmine harmaline, which have their own pretty powerful effects as well. So I would be floating, and this one time I just started focusing my attention on the space in front of me like a kind of arrow, and as I did that, everything started to ripple. So I was like, oh, interesting. So my attention does something, right? My attention can impact the environment, which of course is true in the real world as well, where, not to say
yeah,
that isn't the real world. And so the rules are not so different. And so that means that, okay, but then, then I had no idea what to do. I was like, well, what do I do with the ripples? Like I didn't feel like I necessarily had control to like do anything I wanted. It was much more like just infinitely mysterious and strange. And then
right,
and then I think the skill that was useful was being really discerning and curious about what's in the environment. So like a kind of hyper focus, right? Like kind of, okay, what's going on? Where can I see movement? What feels alive? What feels unusual? And that, that's something I do in normal, in my in mushroom experiences, for example. I'll very much have a sense of if I'm doing, all my mushroom experiences now seem to be like deep inner work. They're not like when I was younger and it was like raw out in nature. And I was often there was elements of deep inner work, and I always
Yeah.
cared about that. But I think because I've been, focused on that, and I think it's the way I'm doing it. I'm also doing a lot of like lying down with music and eye shades, like by
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of, I mean, a couple times a year, or 3 or 4 times a year, but that then induces a particular type of inward going
Right.
experience,
Right.
which
Right.
is, so it's also really contingent on that. It's also the music matters, everything matters. But, I'll be I guess my journeying will often be defined by really, I think mindfulness is probably the most useful tool. Just being like mindful and present and curious and not trying to jump to conclusions.
Yeah.
And then I could see sometimes like some like images or flickers or sensations and be like, okay, that feels like a certain way. What is that? I like zoom into that. And then that unpacks to some kind of part of myself or something I've been avoiding or something I'm longing for or whatever it might be. And then that unpacking, then that, I think I practice something called inquiry, which is, I call it somatic inquiry. It's
Mm.
basically, originally the way I learned it was from the Ridwan school. Do you know Ridwan? Do you know that
No.
tradition?
No.
Which is also called the diamond approach sometimes.
Oh, I've heard that. I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, so they've got a bunch of different names. But they use this talking meditation called inquiry, where as you're talking, you are noticing what's happening in your body, any sensations. You're kind of inquiring into the act of inquiring itself, right? So like a detective of your own experience. So I've done a lot of that, and that has really changed the way I experience psychedelics. I think it changed the way I navigated the DMT extended state quite a bit, because it was like like implicit. One of my teachers, Rafi Morgan, always used to say this, like implicit in the idea of inquiry is I don't know. Like, you don't know. That's what scientific inquiry is.
Right.
If you say, if you say like, okay, I know these are machine elves, or these are this, or I'm going to
Right.
find this,
Right. Right.
you don't actually know that. We don't know that. So you just have to go, in, or let's say I find it really helpful to go in a space as close to possible of not knowing. Now, it's never going to be total not knowing, because you're going to have all these preconceived
Right.
notions somewhere, but as best as possible, just to be like agnostic about the nature of DMT entities, because I still don't know if I would feel comfortable saying definitively what I think they are. I certainly have a lived experience and sense, and would put my money on that they are independently arising to some degree from my own perception of them. I'm not materialist or physicalist. I don't think they're just my brain on drugs. I think they're also my brain on drugs. I think it's way
Right.
more
Right.
complicated. but so just like that energy and that attitude, or it's a skill, it's a skill set of just being like, and anyone can do it. It's just about practicing curiosity. I call it
Yeah.
curiosity hacking. It's like, if you
Yeah.
practice being curious as a practice, you can bring that into the psychedelic experience and then be curious. It's probably one of the best skills, I think, to bring into it. Yeah.
In the next study, one interesting thing that I would, if you can have the presence of mind to do that, I would love to hear what happens, is if you feel like you're having an interaction with one of these beings, if you could ask them something like, is this what you really are, or is this just how you're showing yourself to me because you like, this is
Oh yeah.
how you think I need to perceive you, or what will make sense to me? Can you show me a truer form? Because I always have the senses in my own experiences and in other people's experiences that it's either one of two things: that in the moment they are perceiving an archetype or a phenomenon or a intelligence or a whatever facet of their own psyche, not as it truly is, but as it's manifesting to them. So
Yeah.
it's either that, or it's after the fact, they're reducing it into a box that that makes sense to them. Like, the common one, like, I saw an angel, I saw a demon, I saw Jesus, I saw Mary. Um, that sort of a thing. But the interesting thing to me is that question of, are you showing me this because you think I need to see you like this? And could you show me a more real version of yourself? And what would that be? And what would that feel like? But I also feel like the most overwhelmed I've personally ever been is when you're just so immersed in the alien that it's just like, I don't know what anything is, and I'm feeling a lot. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's just everything, like the dials on everything in your
uh,
body and psyche and mind are turned up. And, like, that talking through things is an interesting approach. But this also reminded me that on some of the peak experiences I've had is I actually have lost control over my mouth and gone into full blown glossolalia, where it's just like
Interesting.
blah blah blah, like just
Yeah.
going from there not being a filter between thinking and talking, so that I'm just saying whatever I'm thinking and I can't control it. Um, but also then that just completely degrading into just mouth noises and like
Yeah.
cackling and crying and just, just like a chattering cat looking at the window of eternity or something like that. Just like,
Yeah.
ah!
I love that. Yeah, man, this is a whole tangent, but I find glossolalia so fascinating. And I've like spontaneously like had conscious glossolalia at times where I've just started like feeling that it was helping me to process just to just do a little under the breast glossolalia, because it does something about taking language and neutralizing it in some way, kind of like a meditative process. It's also, and it comes up in obviously like in evangelical traditions as well. There's a
Yeah,
lot of, and was it Snow Crash? The book Snow Crash, I think, talks about glossolalia. It's like a big part of it.
I
Can't
don't
remember if it was
remember.
that.
I think that's a book that I was told to read a million times and never read.
It's like a Silicon Valley. All
Yeah.
absolutely love it, kind of, and it's a good book. It is a good book. But yeah, but asking, yeah, okay. There's two things about asking about the form, right? Firstly, I
Yeah.
agree with you. I have a sense that the form is heavily our projection, but I'm not sure that the entities are projecting the form. I think we're seeing something and then projecting the form onto them.
Yeah.
At the same time, like in my final dosing on the DMT extended state trial, I started to, because I was like talking to the teaching presence, whatever that may be. And I said, "Oh, this is all kind of sci-fi. This is all quite sci-fi, what we're talking about and the way I'm perceiving all this." And it was like, "Yeah, that's because you read a lot of sci-fi." I was like, "Oh, well, what is it? What would it look like?" Yeah, it was like, "Do you want to see what it looks like without your overlay?"
Wow.
And it was just fucking chaos.
Whoa.
It was just like, it was like um, the veil sort of peeled back, and it was just like, um, I would say like, I would say static or white noise, but there was like a lot of everything in it, right? So it's like colorful white noise static, incomprehensible. And then it sort of quickly peeled back, and I was like, "No, I'm good." It was like, basically the message I got was like, you have to, as a conscious
Yeah.
perceiver, you have to have a frame, otherwise it's just not gonna work. But what would be an interesting question is like, can my frame be closer to the reality? Because that was just an all at onceness, and it was just kind of overwhelming. But that'd be such an interesting question. And the other thing that's really interesting is, don't know if I talked about this last time or the first time we spoke, where the idea of creating a decision tree for people going into DMT space together. Did I talk about that?
I don't think so.
No, maybe not. But they basically just this idea from a sci-fi book by Adrian Tchaikovsky. He's one of my favorite sci-fi writers, and these intermediaries are able to, like, the way that people travel faster than light is by going into unspace, which is a sort of like very similar to DMT space in some ways, except that no one can go in with anyone else. You kind of go in alone in a sense, but they have to go in there to contact these aliens, these giant aliens that are killing everyone, right? They have to, like, that are so vast they don't really get, like, we're like flies to them, but they're trying to find a way to communicate with them. And so they have intermediaries going in at the same time, but they can't talk to each other in that space. So what they have to do, like would be the same with multiple people doing DMT together, is to create a decision tree in advance and be like, okay, so if, with DMT, it might be like, okay, the first entity you see, imagine that you're looking down at the ground. Or, okay, if you encounter this particular type of space, if you find yourself in like an open cavernous space, go up and then right. And we'll all do the same thing. We'll all remember to do the same thing and see if there's any similarity when we come back about what we actually saw.
Wow.
That would be super interesting, right? I think
yeah.
it would take a long time. My sense is we try it and be like fucking chaos, and like everyone had a different experience. But it's a place to start, at least, to go, okay, let's take it seriously that this is a unique standalone space that we're entering, which I think a lot of us feel intuitively it is.
Wow.
Can we control where we enter it? Like, I had this sense of like being powered, like sometimes just like it was just randomly catapulted into this like vast universe at different points.
Yeah.
Like if someone just like spun a globe and was like, dump, okay, you're going there. And now I'm in
Right.
like I'm in the DMT version of Australia, but the next dosing I'm in the DMT version of Alaska, and it's just like, why the entities look so different? So, I like to play with that idea. But so, could we figure out where we enter, and can we figure out what we do when we enter there? And that is a very interesting line of inquiry. And then, of course, any scientist listening to that would be like, yes, but there's so many variables. To which I would counter, the whole clinical trial process is kind of a joke with psychedelics anyway. There's so many variables that it's worth a joke. A joke. It's worth a joke.
You're
It's a very
right. Yeah.
DMT thing to say. It's worth a try.
One of the things I was going to ask you is, obviously many comparisons have been made between mind altering experiences and NDEs, near death experiences.
Yeah.
With DMT in particular, there's all of this speculation that at the time of death, like you get a big dump of DMT, and like that could be like a chemical gateway, or that could be why people have these strange quote unquote experiences as they're dying. But there's a whole, there's been scholarly work done on near death experiences, and there is grammar to the experience, and there is like a narrative. And it's not dissimilar to what people have been talking about for thousands of years, like in the Platonic myth of and so many other stories throughout antiquity. I was curious if anybody, to your knowledge, in the trial had any of those like typical things that you hear about, like seeing their own body from like an outside perspective, or seeming like they were going, through the tunnel toward a light, and then a loved one coming to greet them, or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, they didn't, that I know of. And I think this is a bigger question. I looked at this when writing my book, and there's a paper by Dave Luke and Pascal Michael where they're looking at this question about the similarity between DMT experiences and near death. And they actually suggest in the paper it actually bears more resemblance to alien abduction experiences than it does to near-death experiences, which I really agree with, because my argument on this is this. Like, I've never heard someone having a near-death experience where they talk about, and I'm sure this could be out there, right? But my understanding of it is like the intense fractal geometry and loads of alien entities coming and swarming in.
Yeah.
It's not something I've heard that much with NDEs. I haven't also heard that many people talk about connecting with loved ones who've passed away on DMT, although I think that absolutely can happen, right?
Right as you said that, something flew at the screen. Like a little orb or dust or something, but I don't know what it was. But right as you said that, it went whoosh and came right to. It should be pretty clear on the camera.
Oh, sweet! From my side, my side.
Yeah, on you, by you. Yeah.
Interesting. So I haven't heard that. I haven't heard a lot of the tropes of alien abduction fit with DMT experiences pretty well, and likewise folkloric. Actually, Graham Hancock argued that in his book Supernatural years ago, which I think is a good point. Like, there's a lot of crossover between, like, Irish fairy stories. When I was in the Amazon, I heard lots of folklore stories about entity visitation. Sounded much more like DMT related than the near-death experience. A sort of life review. I haven't really heard that much of people's life review. A life review coming up on DMT. So I think they're phenomenologically quite different from what I've seen or heard about the near-death experience.
Yeah.
Now, I would love to know, is that the case? Is it that people have just not done DMT before, and so they don't have the language or the framing to be like, hey, this was really DMT like? But that's at least where I'm at now from the information I currently have. I'm like, I don't know if, it's not to say DMT isn't released when we die, but who knows?
Yeah, it makes sense. And it does sometimes frustrate me when it's these things are just commonly stated like they're facts. Things like that. It's just like, we don't know that happens, and so, and then it just becomes so commonly said that it just becomes like, like the pineal gland is the third eye, like that kind of a thing. And it's but anyway, and now there will be a million pineal gland is the third eye. Here's a video.
There's zero evidence for it. I didn't actually. I didn't include this in my book around endogenous DMT. I mentioned that endogenous DMT is there, but actually we don't know where it's coming from, like, and what the exact dynamics are. certainly I think, yeah, maybe this will piss people off, but my understanding is that the pineal gland hypothesis is not very strong, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
The only this might be an fun, interesting little sidebar. The only thing I've seen that makes any level of sense is that there is some kind of a photosensitivity to the pineal gland
mm,
because its
mm,
primary function is to secrete melatonin. So
yes,
it's
yeah,
sensitive to light changes in a similar way to the eye in a very basic way, I guess. So in that sense, it's kind of eye-like. But I
yeah,
also think that wherever DMT comes from, it's not the pineal gland. Like I don't think it's the pineal gland. I think it's like some other part of the brain. But
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. We just don't know, right? Like it's yeah,
I was going to say I'm sitting here like talking like I'm debunking something, but I have very little information to go on, and I'm trying to recall something from
yeah, yeah.
that I watched or read a long time ago. But the other thing I was thinking would be a fun sidebar to go down is there's that whole weird kind of physio biological mysticism out there where it's about things like raising your cerebrospinal fluid
Yeah,
and like bringing it up to this like chamber in your brain, and that's what raising kundalini is. And then also, oh, you know that picture of the eye of Horus or whatever, that's actually like the side cut of the brain. And like look at how similar that looks to this, and look at the picture of Adam touching God's finger in the Sistine Chapel. Doesn't that look like the brain? Like, are they encoding that this is, and I kind of get the fascination with that, but I also am kind of turned off by it because it
mm,
seems like they're trying to, it's like, so what are you saying? You're trying to say that these spiritual experiences are just like doing weird stuff with your body that's akin to raising cerebrospinal fluid, and that's how you have a mystical experience? Like,
yeah,
that's kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
boring to me, actually.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's never really, yeah, that stuff. I don't know that much about that sort of set of ideas, but it's also like it's crazy because basically we have this mind body split
Yeah.
that we've been trying to kind of move beyond, in the West especially, and people go in an either or
Yeah.
with it. It's like either it's biological or it's spiritual and psychospiritual, and there's something else going on. But I think almost certainly, like with pretty much everything in reality, it's all at once. It's everything. It's both, and probably more things going on, right? So yeah, I don't know. It's. I mean, the bigger thing is the amount of speculation in this kind of area, which is all good. Like, I'm well into speculation. It's fun,
Sure.
but it's making truth claims based on speculation that bothers me. Like, I get, like the amount of stuff I've seen comments under my Instagram videos where I'm talking about like the DMT extended state, of just the level of certainty people have.
Right. Right.
Also,
Right.
a lot
Right.
of really freaked out Christian people being like, "These are demons." I'm
Right. Of
like,
course. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know, man.
Daimons, maybe. Yeah.
Diamonds, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, actually. The level of trigger some people get, and then
Right.
also just like the level of certainty of like. I actually said to someone, mostly I ignore them, but someone was like, "Yes, this is like this, blah blah blah, of like akashic realms, and that
Of
that
course. Yeah.
entity encounter was this," and I was like, "Yeah, you didn't." You can't really comment on another person's experience overlaying that much stuff. It's just not really, it
Right.
doesn't really make any sense. And they were like, yeah, you're right. Sorry. I was like, oh, that was a nice internet interaction.
Yeah.
One of the better ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, any of this kind of stuff attracts all kinds of stuff. And I've certainly battered my brain against a lot of, I'm just going to call them sus YouTube comments, and I really really try to not interact with any of the toxic ones or any of the just like rambling riddled with misspelling stuff, but it's hard not to get pulled into it sometimes. Um
Yeah.
but yeah, people, yeah, and it's coming from multiple places. Like, one, people's worldview feels challenged, so they feel like they need to um there's actually, now that you bring this up, there's a big whole, it's like a whole genre of YouTube videos about people who have converted to Christianity who used to do psychedelics talking about how demonic psychedelics are and how like demon almost took my soul. You have to understand that a demon almost took my soul. I am not joking. This is real. Like that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
Those types of videos. And again, we return to this, whatever lens you're putting on these things, they really determine your outcome, because can you have very dark, demonic, hellish experiences? Absolutely you can.
Yep. Yep.
And guess what else can happen? You can have an experience where there is no savior, there is no light part of the experience, but guess what? You come out of it, you're okay, you're back to consensus reality, and you strangely eventually become grateful for those experiences and integrate those experiences. And you can use them to in all kinds of like actually ways that change your life and your mental state for the better. Like this is what honestly got me through those really, really difficult ayahuasca experiences, was that you can go through all of that where it's just fractal, tsunami, shipwreck, insanity, torture, demonic chaos for the whole time. And then you come back to consensus reality and you're like, oh, this is such a miracle. This is such a miracle to be like in this like calm, and my heart rate is back to normal and I feel good and I'm alive and I'm in beautiful nature and I'm surrounded by cool people. And it's just, and that in and of itself is an incredibly sacred, amazing experience.
Yeah.
And yeah. So just to say, project, like, you got to be honest with yourself what you're looking for when, not only when you're doing these things, but you're interacting with this content of people talking about these things. Do you want your beliefs to be, do you want this? Are you watching for like confirmation bias? Are you watching to be comforted? Are you watching to find anything that speaks against your worldview so that you can go in the comments and like tell the person why you're wrong? It's just, it's not only true of like entering these altered states, it's true of like the way you're interfacing with reality in general, you know?
Absolutely. And you know what comes up for me with those videos you're describing is shadow work, right? Because I've had those experiences myself, and probably my most transformative psychedelic experience ever was an encounter with absolute evil and sadism, and then it bothering me for about a year and a half. I wasn't like in a huge hole, but it was sort of in the back of my mind. I was like, that was a gnarly experience. What was that? And then I realized after I started, started understanding and reading about shadow work, I was like, oh, that was me. I was like, oh, fuck, that was me. And then that took me on a whole journey. It's actually why I have this tattoo on one arm. Like, I was like, oh, the shadow, fuck. Like, I have the capacity for real fucking sadism and evil inside me. That's but of course, like Jung, pointed out, like, or actually, let's say Anne Shulgin points this out with psychedelic therapy. It's like the shadow becomes this ally if you integrate it and you don't over-identify with it, which was also a mistake I made. It becomes this ally, and this feeling of wholeness and presence and like I'm okay in the worldness I've had from that experience outweighs everything else I've had on psychedelics, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just like completely different. It's much more of a grounded, embodied, solid, like I'm okay. And I think possibly that reaction from like the sort of like newly converted post psychedelic Christians is like Christianity's not, at least traditional Christianity is really not good at shadow work. They have to put all the shadow into Satan. Right. And it has to be this kind of like, no, fight the shadow. It's of course a losing battle. You're always going to lose because you're fighting against your own nature. You have to integrate it, take responsibility for it, feel it in your body, and then bring it into the world in a healthy expression. There's no other, I have not seen another way to do that. Certainly not, like, that's why there's so much fear around it, so much like panic of like, it almost got me, but as long as I just kind of like put up enough defenses and attack on the outside, it's why like really homophobic senators will turn out to be gay.
Right. Yeah, totally.
It's like,
totally.
It's kind of like total trope. It's like, the most angry, scared people are the ones very often who haven't integrated their shadow, and they're getting reactive about what they're perceiving. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely, man. And now you've provided a nice little pathway to get into one of the other major things I wanted to riff with you on, which is that tremendous book, Catafalque.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That tremendous book, Catafalque, which is written by a widely loved scholar of ancient Greek fare, Peter Kingsley. And I'm actually not certain how he got so interested in Jung and decided to do such a deep dive into not only Jung's work, but how it fits with the sort of mystical prophet theme, like how Jung's life itself fits in more with mystics and prophets than scientists, really.
Yes.
And just an incredibly dense work and an incredibly well researched work. I saw how much of the book is dedicated to the citations and the
It's a whole other book
it's
almost.
insane.
It's published in 2 volumes. So you have the one book,
Yeah.
or at least that's the way it first came out. You have the book, and then you have the next book, which is mainly just the
Yeah.
research. It's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll give the gist of it and fill in the gaps, because like I told you, I've been watching interviews with him and have just started it, and I think I've begun to wrap my mind around what he's proposing. But it's essentially that Jung himself was never trying to create a Jungian philosophy. So that's one thing, and that he was actually kind of put off by there being this whole new school of philosophy that is Jungians. And really, what he felt like, what he was trying to communicate, is that each person must go through this sort of archetypal initiatory process of a deep self inquiry into the psyche, and that eventually you get so deep into the psyche that you're kind of in the collective psyche. And when you reach this place of depth, this is not metaphorical, this is not purely psychological in the modern sense, this is like you are entering the depths, you are entering the realm of the dead, of spirits, of archetypes, and they will speak to you and want to speak through you for the purpose of the healing and evolution of all of humanity. And this is what it means to make the unconscious conscious, not just your little pathologies and neuroses and like things you're dealing with personally, but to help the collective evolve through your individual life. And the extent to which we fail to do that, we're actually sort of inching humanity closer and closer to oblivion. Like the subtitle of the book is something like the end, like Carl Jung and the End of Humanity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's that if we all live unconsciously and fully in what he called the spirit of the times, versus actually trying to let the spirit of the depths come through, we're actually collectively careening toward a cliff of unconscious apocalypse, basically, where we end up destroying ourselves and the planet or something like that.
Yeah, and I think Jung talked about that as well, like the eventually with that level of disconnection, we unconsciously start to have this kind of suicidal impulse collectively. It starts to kind of come out. And like Kingsley, I guess what Kingsley's doing, I mean, people should really read the book. It's quite an intense book. It's a powerful book, a bit like for me, a bit like, a very different type of book, but reading like The Power of Now, it's a book that is like a drug. It has an effect. It actually has an almost like tangible effect.
I love that.
Kingsley's work could really be like that. And he also points out, like, like Jung fits into this kind of prophetic tradition of literally that Jung was a mystic and a prophet, effectively he's saying. And he talks quite a bit about what does it actually mean historically to be a prophet. And it's not a place you want to be, because you are howling about what you just talked about that disconnect and about that kind of the disconnect from the dead, a disconnect from place, a disconnect from the deeper levels of reality. You're howling and howling that into the void. Like you're the crazy person standing on a soapbox and everyone's walking to the office around you and they're just kind of they're completely immersed in a completely different reality. And you're listening to the birds tell you things, and you're listening to the spirits of the dead, and you're like, he was like, Kingsley points this out. He's like, it's a fucking agonizing place to be, for, you know, historically. And so Jung, he also kind of touches on like Jung being very aware of what that role is and how people are seen in that role, and kind of being quite careful with how he presented himself and what he put out before he was dead, you know, like what he would like put out. And then also the, you know, he's pretty scathing of modern Jungians by and large, who have done this sort of mimicry of these
Yeah.
deeper levels because they're desperate to be seen as you know, as somewhat having this kind of psychotherapeutic or scientific validity that Jung just wasn't in that way. Like that's his argument. He's like, no, if you read the Red Book and you read Jung's other writings and you read the letters he wrote to people and you know, et cetera, Jung was a mystic at his core and tapped into a very rich mystical tradition in the West, you know. So and Kingsley's older work, Kingsley's previous work, what first made him well known is his work on Parmenides and Empedocles, the
Yeah.
pre-Socratic philosophers, which
I really
he
want to
wrote.
read that.
Yeah, there's a book called Reality, which is really stunning. It was very formative for me. And also Pythagoras is
Yeah.
and the links between, he's got a really short book called A Story Waiting to Pierce You, which is, he writes very poetically as well, right? So he's got a very, and this book is really beautiful, and it's about the links between um Mongolian, or what's now Mongolian, kind of shamanism and Pythagorean Greece, through this kind of tradition of holding an arrow and going into a trance state and walking great distances. So
Wow.
this is an example of like this guy showing up in Greece, and you know, with an arrow, and like I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly, but sort of looking for Pythagoras or someone like him to sort of have this exchange of information.
Did this really
And
happen?
yeah, well, he
Wow.
argues that this was a tradition. Yeah, so it's worth reading the book. So there's certainly someone showed up with an arrow, certainly from the Far East. It seems. I think
Wow.
that's what I remember. And so he also mainly talks in that book about Pythagoras and Pythagoras' role. And like, it's actually quite a while since I read it, but it's really worth checking out. I do think I remember this cool aspect of that arrow trance, which is like, you had to, like, you couldn't be shaken out of that trance because you might die. Like you would be holding this
Wow.
arrow and you would be just like walking for fucking ages. Just, you know, I don't know how long it takes to walk from Mongolia to Greece, but it's pretty long. So there's this whole like interwoven, and another thing Kingsley does, like, you know, with Parmenides and Empedocles, he's pointing out that the West has this deep shamanic tradition at its core,
Yes.
right? And so I think that's really powerful as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you can see in Jung this eventual fascination he has, like this obsession with going back to the Gnostics, back to the Platonic stuff, back to the alchemical stuff, back to eventually the Eastern yogic stuff. Is he's looking, I think he's lens shopping, like kind of what we're talking about. Like he's
Mm-hmm.
already done this primary work of going deep, deep, deep into his own psyche, having these archetypal experiences, meeting what he called his soul, encountering what he called the spirit of the depths. And you can tell that he's longing for lenses that will help him contextualize something that could never ever ever be explained in terms of empirical
Yeah.
measurement or science or these things that he was already trained in as a doctor. And I don't think there is one perfect lens. I mean, and I think you could probably speak to this too, or either share or counter this opinion. But we live in a time where we're exposed to so many ideas, and trying to balance those ideas and do any kind of justice to whatever we're experiencing, and trying to apply those lenses to what we're experiencing and just the human condition in general. It's a difficult thing, and I don't think any one lens can fully capture it. But what I think it allows you to do is sort of what I was saying before, is you kind of become a better storyteller and a better
Mm.
mythologist about the unexplainable ocean of mystery that is being a human being. And and then, you know, the peak of that is a Joseph Campbell, is a Carl
Mm.
Jung, is are these people who could, or back 2,500 years ago, a Plato
Yeah.
who could just take all of these different things from math and geometry to apophatic experiences and
Yeah.
stories and all kinds of shit and condense them down into just incredible stuff. But Jung, I think it's just super important that a book like this exists that places Jung in that lineage of, like, you know, not to sit here and disagree with Kingsley, because, and plus I haven't even read the book, so I don't even know if this is disagreeing. But I think that there's something that occupies a sort of midpoint between a scientist and a shaman.
Mm.
And I think that that's, whatever that is what Jung was, and whatever that is also what Plato was, because there was a recognition among, and there is a recognition among Platonists, that there's a kind of knowing beyond empirical, and
Mm.
that kind of knowing is very important, if not more important than the empirical. But having the education, the life lessons, the theory, the virtue, allows you to extract something from those experiences that someone who doesn't have all of the, like, formal education can't. But I
Yes,
also
definitely.
think but it's also kind of goes both ways, because someone with the formal education can't see the world in the same way as a shaman either. So it's like you're kind of, I don't know, it's like there's a push and pull there. But I think the reason people like Plato and Jung are so attractive to me is because that's the world I live in. Is I do we did get this education, and we are told to look at the world in this way, and it
Mm.
feels like there's a giant part of the story that's missing.
Yeah.
And you can, yeah, you can just do a headfirst dive back into shamanism and try to unlearn everything you learned, but that feels disingenuous to me.
Yeah.
That felt disingenuous to Jung. It felt disingenuous to McKenna. Yet at the same
Yeah.
time, they acknowledged we got to figure out how to square the circle of these things and see more truth through both
Yeah.
ways of seeing, or something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is like also like in integral studies, Ken Wilber's philosophy is like kind of core to it. It's been definitely really, for me, really influential. I find it really important. McKenna I came across before integral, right? Like he talked about running different operating systems,
Yeah.
like people shamanism 2.0 and like New Yorker 5.1, but you don't run just one because that doesn't work. You got to run multiple. And, there's this kind of quip in the meta modernism community, which is like whoever has the most perspective, whoever dies with the most perspective wins. It's like
Right.
there's something to that, right? There's a sense of perspective taking where we still stay connected to our own unique sense of solidity and sense of self, right? It's a kind of dance, and maybe the people like Plato and these sort of figures were able to just dance that dance with a fluency that was maybe innate or maybe it was trained. But I think we all need to learn some version of that dance at this time in history. Like that's why I think psychedelics, that's one of the reasons I think psychedelics are powerful agents of change if we use them in that way, because they teach us, or they can teach us, what it actually feels like to hold multiple perspectives at the same time, to like jump between different possibilities instead of
Yeah.
just fixating on one, and actually feel all of that in your body and have that experience. So I think it creates more sort of psychological flexibility, more sort of fluidity being in the world, fluidity with weirdness, which is
Yeah.
like also essential for the times we live in. It's just like, how do you manage the uncanny, the weird, the bizarre? So I think that's really, really core. But if I had to boil it down, it would be something around like holding multiple perspectives. Is like you say, multiple lenses. It's absolutely one of the and it's an additive approach. It's a yes and. It's like improv. It's like yes and. There's this perspective and there's this perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what can you? how much perspective can you take? Because it gets hard because we all have bias. We all have
Yeah,
ways we would like the world to be. And there are lenses that just are not going to harmonize with what you want, with the way that you want the world to be. Like I'm not sitting around reading anti-natalist philosophy, like I'm not sitting around reading like nihilist philosophy. And whenever I do read it, I honestly it's almost funny to me in a kind of
yeah,
gothy hot topic kind of like woe is me way
yeah,
that's just like that I can't seriously put myself there. But
yeah,
that's a problem, honestly, because you have to, if you're realistic, you have to acknowledge that those people might be right and I might be wrong and I might be living
yeah.
in a delusion that's just some way to comfort myself. That's not what I think. But if you want to approach like a philosopher, if you want to approach with a disposition of learning or doing shadow work, you got to look at why you brush those things off and diminish them, and that's not always easy to do. That's challenging.
For sure. I mean, there's this other, yeah, it is. And look, we all have a limit to what we also, every day is different. How
Yeah,
hungry am I is going to impact how many different perspectives I feel like holding.
totally.
So, and then also, what feels important with that is that it doesn't, this is the problem with postmodernity and the problem with the condition we live in modern society, in a post-truth world. It doesn't work to hold multiple perspectives if you don't have a foundational truth
Yeah, right.
that you're connected to, like the sacred. Like there is a foundational point, and there is such a thing as truth. Otherwise, you get what Ken Wilber calls a perspectival madness. You just don't have a perspective
Yeah,
because every perspective is equally valid. I don't think every lens is equally valid.
100%.
I think on one level that someone believes it. I mean, it's the therapeuticization or the psychotherapy influence in culture that I think has partly led to us having the idea that everyone's perspective is equally valid. Everyone's lived experience as a person, I think, should be listened to and is important because they're a human being and they're having an experience. And so
Yeah,
in that sense, it can't be like one person's experience is better than another's. That doesn't make sense to me. So that kind of egalitarianism, I'm totally on board with. But saying every perspective is equally valid is kind of nonsense, because I'm not like,
totally.
I don't walk into the cockpit of the airplane being like, don't worry guys, I've got this. I have an idea about how to fly a plane, and I think it's pretty special. And it's my idea, and you're allowed to disagree with it because it's special. Like, it's stupid. No, we don't actually act like that. And so we all have an understanding that we each have a unique perspective, and our unique perspective is going to be particularly powerful in particular arenas and not in other arenas. And that's why we have to work together. Like, that's, yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's so undeniable when it comes to concrete reality. And I think personally, it's undeniable when it comes to spirituality, philosophy,
Mhm.
metaphysical things. But I think that that's a much harder discussion. Like, how do I communicate effectively that I think the whole starseed Pleiadian narrative, I'm sorry, but it's not as good as like the platonic, like, corpus of wisdom and all the thinkers who came after him, on up to the modern mathematicians who are mathematical
Yeah.
Platonists. Like, those things don't equal one another. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Like, I find one to be far superior, but trying to communicate that in a way that's not just like so dismissive and
Yeah.
so, that actually brings, maybe I don't need to bring people together. Maybe who cares? Maybe it's like, yeah, okay, you want to believe in that stuff, go believe. I don't care. But
Yeah.
um but I do want to find some kind of common ground. And I think, because I think it's because of what you said. If you don't have whatever that true north is,
Yeah.
that there is some absolute truth that we all need to be able to agree on, or at least I need to be able to operate from,
Yeah.
that is a good foundation for me to, let's say, individuate from, then I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm curious for you what that ground is and how you found it.
Yeah. I mean, what is that ground for me? I mean, I would say it's not a proposition like a knowing that. It's a sense of connection, sense of like a foundational aliveness, consciousness, and interconnectedness at the heart of reality, right? I guess it would be a kind of panpsychist or maybe idealist kind of approach of like
Yeah.
the universe is alive, conscious. We're part of it. We're an expression of that consciousness. So that's pretty simple. Like, that's been my experience, certainly through my mystical experiences. I don't necessarily always act like that, but I would at least strive to act
Yeah.
like that at a foundational level, to be like, you know, it's trite, but we're all one, that at that kind of fun foundational level.
Yeah.
And then just in terms of like the more social level, I think one really good uh, benchmark for me, which actually is a Christian idea. I think Jesus says, like, they ask, how will we know this is true? It's like, well, by its works, like what it
Right.
does in the world.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, if believing you're a Lemurian star child is better than the kind of rich tradition of Western philosophy and, people who, just like kind of many other traditions, Eastern philosophy, whatever it might be, then the impact it has on communities and people's psychology and the way they live their lives, how connected they are, how kind they are to one another, should be better than, let's say, all of Christianity or all of Buddhism or all of Hinduism or all of Islam. Like, it's
Right.
like, okay,
Right.
is it better? Because I would say no, because what it actually creates is like deep sense of confusion. It's commoditized. It doesn't make any sense. It gets culty dynamics form. And actually what ends up, people end up more or as lost and sad
Yeah.
as they were before. So it's like, well, that's for me a good benchmark of it. And if someone like came up with some, out there idea where they're like, yeah, we worship this plant pot and the plant pot knows all, and they were like, contributing to the community, they're sending kids to school, they're building stuff, they're all really happy, they're lovely people, I'd be like, fuck it, man, this, like, I'm totally down, this plant pot's got something to it. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to worship it, but it's got something, so what's going on here? Then I'd be curious about it. And
It
I
sounds like
think,
a Rick and
yeah,
Morty episode, doesn't it?
yeah,
There's
it
like
does, doesn't it?
some planet
It's,
where they're like, "Don't look at that thing, Morty. Don't
it's
look at
literally
there."
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's totally it. There's like two plant pots on my desk, so like that's what I worship now. I guess that's my it's my new gods. Yeah.
Have you watched the most recent season of Rick and Morty?
No, it's all very high on my list.
So one thing, there's new voice actors now because they kicked Justin
To keep
Roiland off,
just enough.
and it is somewhat noticeable. Like you kind of get
Okay,
used to it after a couple episodes, but the guy who plays Morty in particular, like it feels a bit different. But man,
interesting.
I won't spoil it, but there's one episode in particular that's so preposterous that I would just remember what the main theme of the episode was throughout the episode and just laugh and shake my head throughout it because it's just I can
Great.
see how at this point some people might think that show has overstayed its welcome, but to me it's still just so out there and crazy that
I
it's fun to
love it,
watch.
man.
But
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I'm gonna
um
watch it soon.
back to the thing about what is the ground, what is that thing that we can all agree on? And I really do think that this notion of consciousness being something real and innate and unbound is slowly really penetrating the zeitgeist. Like
Yeah.
this idea of panpsychism or cosmopsychism or idealism, I'm sure it's still fringe among academics, but it seems like among the people who are quote unquote spiritual but not religious, which is this
Mm,
vast swath of the population that's growing all the time,
yeah.
that kind of seems to be the thing that everybody agrees on. And if we
Mm,
really think about what that entails, and not in a way where we like are guessing, because I mean I love to guess about the metaphysical situation of like what's the consciousness doing, is the consciousness
yeah.
thinking, is there a I love that, but what I mean is, okay, well, what is it just logically in a like a platonic kind of way? Like if you and I are about to have a dialogue, like a
Yeah.
platonic dialogos, unpacking what that means, the very first thing is that there's something more basic that I grew out of, that I'm connected to, that I'm going to return to,
Yeah.
and that's true of literally everyone. And what does that unifying factor that we all share imply. It directly implies that to do violence to anything or anyone is not to figuratively do violence against yourself. It's to literally do violence against
Yeah.
yourself. And right there, think about like we're back to the holy predisposition when it comes to interacting with another being, because you really are constructed of the exact same seed as me, living a different experience. And as cheesy as that sounds, if you really live in that world, and if everyone really lived in that world, I don't think it would be possible to be as fractured or as disconnected as
Yeah.
we are. Like if that idea was just like do you know the idea of the noble lie in Plato's Republic?
No, I don't think so.
It's sort of just like, I mean, to be frank, it's sort of like, yeah, we're going to put the lower classes in the matrix, but it's for their own good.
Oh,
And,
yes, this I do know. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's kind of like that. But what I mean in this sense is, even if we can't prove what I just said,
Yeah.
the world would be a better place if we all operated as if that was true. And I would almost be comfortable having that be taught to the youngest children. Like
Yeah.
we all come from one mysterious consciousness and we don't understand it. And but you know, you're in it. Jonathan over there is in it.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and and you know, imagine if kids just had that idea out of the box. It might be
Also, it might connect with their lived experience of the world, because kids are naturally much more animistic and much more connected to the world as a living conscious place, and so and yeah, it's about the stories we tell. It's about the stories we tell about what is real. Because if we have the story, I make this kind of where my DMT extended state experiences led me, my final dosing, and then so I have a chapter in my book about this as the kind of core shift that psychedelics could bring on the more social level. Is this movement towards this worldview,
yeah.
because it's fundamentally different. And it even changed my mind about things that I was a little bit skeptical before about, which is like, for example, giving legal personhood to rivers and trees and rocks,
Wow.
and like lakes. I read about that and I was like, okay, that's kind of a weird gimmick. But then
Yeah.
afterwards I was like, well, no, actually, it's actually quite clever, because we have legal personhood for corporations and they're not a real thing, but a
Right.
lake is a real thing. Like a tree is a living thing. And we know that trees have a consciousness of some sort and communicate with each other and have individual differences and make it, I was walking around earlier today, and it's like springtime in London, and I read this book, The Hidden Life of Trees, a few years, like last year, where he's talking about, just how interconnected and and fascinating trees are, and the fact that individual trees make their own decisions, like about how to, like when to flower, for example. And I was like, in the worldview that we have, you look at a tree and it looks like dead matter because it's not moving. And you sort of know it's alive because you learned that in biology class, but you're like, yeah, but it's not really alive like I'm alive, right? It's like it can't move, and yeah, okay, it spreads its seeds around, but and then just like looking at a tree that hadn't yet, most of the trees haven't flowered yet, I was like, that tree is going to decide, because the risk is if you do it too early and a late frost comes, you've expended a huge amount of energy in getting your leaves back, and they get, fucked. And then you're really in a bad, like you're behind, and then you're in a bad way and you're like at a disadvantage. And there are even examples of like 3 trees from the same seed that have grown together who have different strategies.
Wow.
Some of them will be like, okay, I'm going to go super fast and take the risk. And others will be like, nope, I'm going to go slow. It's like, it's fascinating. So just knowing that about trees, I was walking around the park and I was thinking, yeah, you guys have some decisions to make, because it could be, it's this early March, like there could be a frost. Don't know what I would do in that situation, but Godspeed. It's already, you're in a kind of communication. You have an appreciation of what they are going through, what their decisions are, what their kind of like what is happening with them. So that's already a completely different orientation, and we could have that with each other. Obviously, it's the first place, and then also just with the rest of the natural world. So yeah, I think it would absolutely be like, for me, that's the story I want to move towards.
Yeah,
Culturally, that's the story I want to see us move towards.
really well said. And yes, side tangent on just how interesting plant consciousness is, because,
Mhm.
you know, I'm with you that there is some kind of consciousness and intelligence in plants. It's clear. I mean, for so many reasons. One, if you look at a plant on a really fast time lapse, suddenly that thing is not just sitting still like we perceive it to be. It's moving and orienting much more slowly, but it's moving, it's doing stuff, it's reaching out, it's forming relationships, not to mention there's a whole relationship under the ground that's occurring. But I'm assuming you've heard about that experiment where they have shown that plants can be taught. I don't know if it's Pavlovian learning or conditioned response learning,
Mm.
but there's a couple of them. So one is they. I wish I could remember the scientists who did this or what book this is from, but I think I may have heard it on a Radio Lab episode a long time ago.
Mm.
But they would do this experiment where they would have a stimuli before opening or turning on a light. It was either opening something that exposed the sun, or it was turning on the light that gave nutrition.
Right.
And the stimuli was like a fan or something. And what they found is they taught the plants to react to the fan before the light, because you could just argue, oh no, it's light, they're just responding to the light, they don't know what they're
Yeah,
doing.
yeah,
But in this case, they were able to teach plants somehow that this stimuli means this is about to happen. So that's
very
wild.
cool. It's awesome. That's super cool.
Then
Yeah.
there's another one where I don't remember the kind of plant, but it's a kind of plant that has a pretty remarkable response to like potential danger or trauma, where it closes itself up. Like
Mm.
if a something that might eat it comes by, it closes up. If it gets bumped, it closes up. So what they did is they put this plant on a platform, and they would lower the platform, and that would cause the plant to do the fear response. But
Ah.
then after a certain amount of times, the plant somehow quote unquote realizes that it's not in danger,
Ah.
and it
Yeah.
doesn't close up.
That's awesome.
So not only is that interesting, but then ask the mind fuck of all mind fuck questions. Where is its intelligence
Yeah.
center? Because it doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have, like, I don't think it has hormones, or it doesn't have sensory organs. It's but it yet it clearly has some level of learning.
Mm. Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
weird.
It's incredible. And I think this is like, it's this kind of research that helps like change the attitude around the environment, right? And
Yeah,
climate change, for example. Like like instead of the messaging that sort of the system we have can send about huge problems like that is weak because it doesn't understand the problem really, right? It kind of conceptualizes it. But if we understand things in terms of relationships,
yeah,
because then immediately, even hearing that story, I have a relationship to that plant in my head, because it's like me in some way,
right,
because it's like going through shit, it makes decisions, it learns things. So if there's no relationship to the environment, there's no giving a shit about us messing it up, right? There has to be relationship, and that's what a lot of indigenous cultures have. They have deep relationship to place and land. So yeah, I think that's also a really fundamental part of it. It's also something that we get with psychedelics. If we, that example I gave of, tripping and seeing that Portuguese sort of family crest, it's like, that's just one tiny example of just like, I have a new relationship to this land. I don't fully understand it, but I feel like I never forgot that. And I'm like, okay, I feel like I know some small aspect of the essence of this land, right?
yeah.
And that's very, it's a very different state of being to just kind of thinking of it abstractly.
Yeah, and this definitely circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning as well, of just feeling like almost an alien in the
Yeah.
world, and you're in whatever you're doing, versus really feeling like an integral part of it that must exist. And that's sort of Alan Watts, you are a thing the whole universe is doing. You know,
Yeah.
that like that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that kind of a palpably felt way, it makes such a gigantic difference. Um, maybe I'll I don't know why I just thought of I think I know why I thought of it, because before we were talking about the spirit of the depths, this idea that we really are in this phenomenologically real, at least, way, seemingly knit into this energy network that never stops.
Yeah.
But if we are, and there is this just like field of consciousness that
Mm.
we are somehow participating in or born from, what do you think that means for death in terms of, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to dress up and make fancy the question, what do you think happens when we die? Because you're someone who's gone deeper into the frontiers of consciousness than almost anyone. And I've had my experiences, I've talked to a lot of people with a lot of experiences, but you've downloaded a lot of lenses, you've played with a lot of operating systems, you've had a lot of experiences. Has there ever been an experience that you've had or an understanding you've come to on where the body ends and where this starts, or what happens when the body ends and this something else starts? Do you have any strong thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, obviously, it's still like it's a deep mystery, and I think always will be a deep mystery. And then on the other hand, I've had experiences with um, what seemed like having messages from people who had died,
Wow.
which I think is very common for people around the world. But especially DMT, especially after DMT, which some of which were like really quite uh, shook me a lot more than DMT, to be honest. So I've had a few of those experiences where I'm like, okay, that's very interesting. Although I also don't have, I think it's really complicated, complex, or it's very complex in my mind because I'm like, I don't think the individual expression survives death in the same way. I don't know though, maybe it does, but I think we each have an individual expression which is sort of interfuse. I like the idea of the soul. This kind of comes from the Celtic tradition, like the soul being around the body instead of the inside the body, right? Instead of animating the body somewhere inside it, it's like there's the soul surrounds the body and surrounds everyone else's body and plants and you know, perhaps rocks, who knows, like that there's a sense of this kind of uniqueness that forms and an imprint of uniqueness. And maybe this is perhaps why, you know, maybe it is possible that the dead can communicate for some time, but this kind of uniqueness that forms around a living thing, that then when that living thing dies is still present in some sense, and then becomes the all, you know, and then perhaps manifests itself in some way. Maybe there's some kind of continuity where it does manifest itself in some way in a new living form. So that's basically my best guess from my experiences and like just my sense. Um, because I think there's something very powerful about death being an ending as well, not a sort of like void. Because I think, you know, like Alan Watts says, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So I don't think there's a sort of absolute nothingness,
Yeah.
but I do think there's an ending, a profound ending of something. You know, that is just what the message of death seems to be to me. And if it wasn't like that, I don't think there'd be any point to living, frankly. I even think the idea of a heaven makes life meaningless. Like, why would I want to be me forever in eternity doing what? It doesn't really tie in with what consciousness is, right? There's none of the forgetfulness of forgetting who you are and then sort of like manifesting again and creating again. Like it's very so I think there has to be some sense of, or my sense is that there's some sense of ending. There's some sense of ending, but not a sense of complete annihilation of the
Yeah.
individual. There's some I don't quite know, but there's obviously but there's something in there, right? Yeah.
Could you see where I was kind of trying to, I guess, introduce this notion that perhaps this incredible experience that you were able to have several times where you were
Mm.
doing intravenous DMT and plunging into this other realm. I was trying to introduce the concept that maybe there's some connection between whatever happens when we die and there. And it does, and I totally agree that it does phenomenologically seem fairly different to what you hear people say who have had like real near death experiences from like cardiac arrests or whatever. But given that, do you still get the sense that perhaps the two are in some way connected?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some way, I do. Like, in some sense, that kind of like maybe a bardo realm, like in Tibetan Buddhism,
Yeah,
where this
right.
kind of world between worlds, or at least that there's different levels of awareness and consciousness. Um, it doesn't feel like heaven. It
Right.
doesn't feel like. I'm not sure I want to permanently be in DMT space. Although who knows? Maybe who knows? Like maybe it's our interpretation of something that's so completely out of our frame of reference, and so beyond us, and of course ayahuasca is the vine of the dead. It's about, that's the understanding in that tradition, like, in the Shipibo tradition, for example, as far as I understand it, is like, this is, you're communicating with the spirits of the dead, or at least
Yeah.
sometimes. So it's like, yeah, very possible. But I think it's so unknowable from our perception. Like, it's so like the idea that I'm going to be a sort of giant multidimensional squid after I die, floating around
Right.
there. That I don't think is going on. I think there's different. I think there's something different, but it feels more like it feels closer to death than life, but it also feels, yeah, it feels like closer to something completely other.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's my sense of it.
Yeah. Oh, that just reminded me that when you said that you see that circle, like this spherical sort of thing,
Yes.
the Platonists say that the soul is a circle and is like a sphere, and
Mm.
it's always depicted as
Oh.
like a sphere. And sometimes it's funny because I don't know if you ever look at those like esoteric pieces of art or alchemical art and
Mm.
just look at, wow, like there's so much weird shit in these. The
Yeah.
more I read Plato and just other Western esoteric and hermetic stuff, you start to recognize bits and pieces. And a lot of
Ah.
times you'll see a sphere with like two wings on it in some of those pieces of art.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what they're depicting, is like some kind of soul flight or some kind of sense of like
Mm.
of soul, I don't know, being outside the body or something. Um, but this
That's
is true.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
I
know that
thought it was
symbol. I've seen
interesting.
that symbol. Yeah.
But also it's that soul in general is always seems to be circular. So whether we're talking about the, that cosmic soul that I was talking about before, or we're talking about like the individual soul, it's somehow circular, apparently.
Mm.
And I think that has to do with this idea that in the higher realms, like the noetic realms that are more unchanging and immortal, like what
Yeah.
it makes sense that circularity would be indicative of unity and infinity, right? Because it's a never
Yeah.
ending, like you can just travel that loop instantly. Whereas
Yeah.
we live physically in and they call it this, the realm of becoming.
Mm.
Um, the realm of becoming is not circular. It's like you have a starting point and you have an ending point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
every physical object has a starting point and an ending point,
Yeah.
which I think is a pretty elegant way to talk about entropy before like thermodynamics existed. Is like they
Mm.
were able to figure out somehow that there is just this built-in tendency with the physical world that everything will disintegrate. There's nothing
Yeah.
in the physical world
Yeah. Yeah.
that will stay infinite. And then that evokes the question of, well, what is infinite, and what can we know that is infinite? And that's one of the obsessions of the Platonists, of course, and that's why they're so
Mm.
obsessed with math and geometry. And yeah, that was just a complete side ramble, but I do think that there's something interesting about that, the circular soul idea,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Nice one.
Um, well, we've solved life and death and
I
the
think we've
other
done it.
realm, and yeah,
We've
yeah.
cracked it.
We didn't get quite as deep into Kingsley as I would have liked to, but I need to read more of it anyway. So, um,
Yeah, man. I mean, it's I envy you the first reading of Catafalque. I mean, it's and also reality and his other work. Like, I mean, it's special. It's special work. Yeah.
he's one of those people that seems really special because everybody that I respect is just like
Yeah.
clearly communicates that Kingsley is the man.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even I might have sent you this, but there's an interview he did with Murray Stein, the Jungian author and analyst, who's a
Yeah.
really highly respected guy. But yeah, he did this interview where they're talking about a lot of the themes from Catafalque, and he makes this statement that I found so compelling and chilling that I clipped it out and posted it. But it's that clip of Kingsley saying, "Stop looking forward so much and look deep into yourself and
Mm.
listen, and you will find the dead there." And it's an exact quote
Ooh,
from
beautiful.
Jung's Red Book. And then from
Wow.
there he launches into a whole thing about how, like, this is not metaphorical. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
this is real. And Jung knew it was real. And yeah, it's like chilling and animating stuff. There's just
Yeah.
that kind of profundity that sometimes people talk with that you're like, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. He's gone deep, but Kingsley's gone deep in his own practices, I think.
Has he?
But yeah. Yeah.
Do you know this for
Incubation.
sure? Okay.
Yeah. He talks about it. Yeah. Incubation. Sufi. He's Sufi. So
Oh, really?
yeah, he does a Sufi incubation practice of a kind of a death meditation. It's kind of like a death meditation, the way he describes it. He argues that incubation was a really core practice in the ancient world. Really kind of like, yeah, it's, I think you're in for a treat
Yeah, I
because
can't wait to get more into it,
to it.
man. I
Yeah.
can't wait. Well, this has been fucking awesome, man. I love talking to you.
You too, man.
Come
It's,
back
as
anytime.
always, huge pleasure. It's so fun to riff. I love it.